Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the week 11 lecture for motor control and learning. So this week the week 11 lecture builds off the lecture from last week. So we'll be using some of the ideas that we've learned about last week and applying them to the situation of coordinating between people as opposed to coordinating our limbs with respect to other limbs. So we're going to be focusing on this topic of interpersonal coordination and motor creativity. So we'll be looking at this dynamical systems theory again, but now talking about how it gets expanded to situations where we're coordinating our behavior with other people. We'll look at some of the evidence that supports this and then some applications for helping people to develop and find skills, new skills, and called creativity or motor creativity. So these are the learning outcomes for this week. Take a moment to look through these, and we will be touching on these at the end. As you should be able to address these by the end of the lecture in preparation for the exam. These are the three general questions that I want you to be thinking about as we move through the material for this week. So the first is, what is the difference between interlimb and inter-individual coordination? How would you explain this? Is it more or less useful to learn with someone better than us? What are your thoughts on this? And why did Fosby flop? This question here. So the Fosby flop is famous for, Dick Fosby's famous for the first athlete to use jumping over a high jump bar backwards, and he used this at the Mexico 68 Mexico Games and won gold medal. And so it's a famous example of motor creativity. I'm asking, why did that technique emerge? So interpersonal coordination. So this theory, dynamical systems theory, it's interesting for understanding how we coordinate our actions with one another, because it helps to explain how it is that we're able to do this in cooperative and competitive tasks. It allows us to address these practical questions of how do we design training situations to support team performance. So how do we do things so that we can operate at a team level? And it relates nicely to these findings that socio-cultural factors also play a key role in the way in which new skills are developed. And the figure here that I've presented on the left gives an example of the dynamical systems theory applied to two people. So the idea is, you've got two independent systems. This is an example of potentially two combatants who are going to fight one another. They're two different individual movement systems. And when they're brought together due to constraint, so the task of fighting one another, for example, to score points on one another, you end up with, according to this theory, you end up with a single system and a synergy, if you will, where the two individual players are a component and they start to mutually constrain one another. So one person's movements are going to affect my movements and vice versa. And this gives rise to opportunities to perceive chances to throw or to act, right? And so the system, when these two people come together under constraints, instead of thinking about this system as made up of two different independent components, we think of it as a single system with interacting components. So if we look at this theory, the way how we would summarize it as a statement. So in dynamical systems theory, our movement system is controlled by establishing temporary relationships among components of the movement system, our joints, and the environment. So we learned that last week. The performer and the environment become considered as a single system where behavior emerges from interaction among constraints that constitute the system. So when we think about multiple people, when they interact, they move and create information with respect to one another. And in contexts involving interpersonal coordination, this involves individuals collectively representing a single system. So learning in dynamical systems theory becomes distributed across the individuals that are involved in this learning system. Each individual mutually constrains one another, creating information, opportunities for action, for learning on the basis of that mutual constraint. Individuals learn, therefore, by co-adapting to one another under constraint. So someone moves, I adapt to that, they co-adapt, and this creates information that we both benefit from. Okay, so these are the four main concepts that we're going to touch on for interpersonal coordination. The first is this idea of multiple scales of analysis. So this is a concept that in dynamical systems, it's used to determine, the level at which we're trying to study the system. In sport and physical activity, in therapy, we're generally interested in an ecological scale of analysis. So this is the scale of analysis between the individual and their environment. So I've represented here 3 different scales of analysis to exemplify this idea. The first scale, we spent some time looking at this scale of analysis, which is the scale of analysis where we look at the interaction between different brain regions representing components in a dynamic system. So we might have a brain region for motor planning or strategic control and verbal cognitive regions of the brain. If they're interacting, we're looking at the scale of analysis of the neuron, of the central nervous system or the brain. We've looked at, particularly last week, and of course throughout the course, we've also looked at a lot at the scale analysis where we look at intra-individual coordination, so looking at the relationship between joints of a single person. And there's this ecological scale where we might look at the interaction or the scale of analysis between the person's movement and their environment. This would be the ecological scale of analysis. So as I move, what's my impact on, or how does my relationship to some key object or task, how is that maintained or changed? This scale of analysis, the final one is, we're looking at this level of coordination between two people, or interpersonal coordination. We have a game of futsal here represented, and if we were to look at the interaction between these two people, this is also an ecological scale of coordination, looking at one person with respect to some other important object in the environment and a second person. And we would call this sort of coordination interpersonal coordination. This would be intrapersonal, and this is interpersonal. Okay. So scale of analysis simply refers to the spatial temporal scale at which a phenomena is observed. Cognition might be neural, behavior, you're looking at, so in terms of time and position, if we're looking at the neural scale, we're going to be trying to measure things in milliseconds and at the micro scale. For the behavioral scale or the ecological scale of analysis, we're going to be talking about things or trying to measure things in terms of, centimeters and meters, and probably in time scales of seconds or minutes. Okay, so the scale of analysis impacts on, your measurement system essentially. So again, when we look at interpersonal coordination, this is primarily being focused on or addressed at the ecological scale of analysis. And when we do this, we can find that there are emergent collective patterns in sport teams that we can observe, or in systems that involve human interaction, that we can think about those collective patterns using a complex systems approach, and they often get described as complex social systems. And there are some properties of these systems. There's an inherent self-organization process where some order or pattern emerges from simple rules among the system components. And so when I use this term self-organization, another way it's been used, or you might think about it, is like, you probably heard that phrase before, something is equal to more than the sum of its parts, right? This is a phrase that is talking to or referring to this concept of self-organization. So we have more complex behavior occurring that's not predicted by any single component, relies on all of those components coming together and interacting. And these interactions, they're relatively simple, repeated, and they're produced at this sort of local scale, but when it's done en masse, it produces these complex adaptive patterns at a global group level. So in these systems, we also notice that if we extend it to talking about movement for humans in sport, we talk about coordination, interpersonal coordination, intrapersonal coordination as emerging from those interaction, and they're emerging under certain constraints on the system. So it might be the task constraints, the field markings, the weather conditions, player characteristics. All of those constraints influence in some way, or they interact in order to in ways that shape the sort of patterns that emerge and that are functional for those systems to achieve what they want to achieve. So if we look at this, perhaps a simple example is of these birds. As they're flying, right, we've got this interesting pattern where we have a kind of a V shape. And rather than saying, well, it's this leader bird here that is dictating the movement of all of these other birds, that's not what happens. What happens is this is a fairly energy efficient situation for the birds to move in. So as long as they're relatively close to one another and flying at the same general level, and as one bird is leading the pack, he's getting all of the forces, he's going to start to tire and potentially drop away, and other birds are going to be able to take over that role. And so some birds get to rest while others get are getting the benefit of flying behind the others, so they naturally will come forward, and the process will repeat. We can also look at other systems. So birds, these birds here, these gannets, nesting gannets, these birds typically are pretty, they're not very friendly. They're not very friendly with one another. But during nesting season, there's a kind of incentive for them to come together, for biological reasons, right? And we see these interesting patterns where they don't get too close because they're nesting, right? So they do space each other. They do create this little space effect, right? So this interesting pattern here. We can also see this impact in herding behavior. So, what I've shown here, we've got a petri dish of ants. And turns out if you were to observe ants in this petri dish, and you give them a way out of the petri dish with a little hole, and then you put some sort of agent that's toxic, maybe some lemon juice or some acid or something like that, the ants will start to try to escape. And it turns out that ants in this situation behave very similarly to the way humans behave when there's a fire in a building and there's only so many holes through which they can escape. And we can predict, or we can actually learn how to design architecturally, learn how to design things in order to prevent this sort of herding behavior where these exit points aren't being used optimally, right? Herding behavior essentially in this sense is dangerous because everybody starts to follow one another, and all of these people here, they could be escaping, but they're getting trapped and potentially injured by the threat, or it could be that the people who are trying to crowd through this door, are hurting and injuring one another. Okay, so there's another important point that I'm making here is that these principles and these properties, they're generalizable. They don't just work for humans, right? They also work for other complex systems. So we can generalize our findings across these different situations to some extent. And theories that are generalizable are interesting because it suggests that they're onto being able to explain a really interesting phenomena. And the very final example I'll give here is, let's look at this image of a football team. We can see that we've got an attacking team here. I believe, and then this must be an attacking team, and we have a defensive team, the team in black, and we have this sort of a natural pattern that emerges, right? Because where one team's on one side and the other team's on another side, and that's because of the way things work when you've got we've got a scrum and you want to pass it to players. You've got an onside rule in rugby. You also, when you're carrying the ball in rugby, you don't want to find yourself all by yourself all of a sudden, right? Because otherwise they're going to strip the ball off you. So you've got to move in groups. So you see these natural patterns that emerge and that are functional. So when we study interpersonal coordination, we can think about each individual member as a degree of freedom. So we learned about degrees of freedom last week, where we thought about joints as degrees of freedoms, right? That get, one of our joints might get locked when we're first practicing the skills to freeze our degrees of freedom to make it easier for us, and we slowly start to release the degrees of freedom. And we can use the same sort of concept to think about people. So two people interacting together, each person being considered a degree of freedom in that system. And the main difference between the two, like a degree of freedom based on our joints, right? Intrapersonal coordination, where we have body segments acting as in some coupled way or coordinated way. These systems that are, again, these degrees of freedom, the thing about them is they're physically coupled, right? They're coupled by the body segments. Whereas with interpersonal coordination, they're not coupled by a physical, mechanical relationship. They're coupled informationally, right? They're coupled by, we see where the other person is, and so it's a looser coupling. It's not as strong a coupling. So if I move, it's going to take a little bit more time for the other person perhaps to move and adjust to my change in position or to coordinate with me. So we call this, what I've just described there, as interpersonal coordination, right? And the other phrase the other term here is extrapersonal coordination. This is coordination, getting more specific when we're talking about coordination between ourselves and the environment. So this example here gives an example where the person at the front, if we assume they're coordinating their actions just with the water, right? That's an example of extrapersonal coordination. The person behind them can see the person in front. So there's an opportunity for interpersonal coordination. Okay, so let's look at a situation where we use these scales of analysis in a 1 versus 1 competitive sport, or look at the ways it's been used to study people in team sports, and also 1-versus-1 competitive sports. So interpersonal coordination, it's where one individual coordinates the movements with another. And we can think about two types of interpersonal coordination. We can think about cooperative and competitive forms of coordination. So, the previous example where two people are rowing, that's a cooperative situation. When you're looking at 1-versus-1 situations, here I've presented some two squash players. This would be a competitive type of coordination. So cooperative interpersonal coordination is where the individuals move in such a way as to maintain a particular relationship. They're trying to sustain a particular way of moving together. A competitive situation is where one or another individual is trying to break an existing stable relationship. So they're trying to create a break in that whatever pattern is being sustained. They're trying to transition to a different state where that it's no longer working, to some other state, where they have some advantage, typically. So opponents, when we have situations where we're 1-versus-1 or in team sports situations, opponents try to use or develop strategies to destabilize coordination in order to gain advantage. It might be through a change up in the shot placement, some deceptive movement, changes in rhythm, right? And those of you who play these sorts of sports, these strategies are things that these are tools in the toolkit to help you win. And what they do, if you think about the ebb and flow of a match, they create this opportunity to break or change the way in which that system's working, so that you can exploit that breakdown, maybe by gaining advantage, scoring a point, whatever it is. And on the figure here, what I've talked through in talking through the data, what we have in this data set are examples of in-phase and anti-phase relationships or behavior of two people playing squash. So we learned about in-phase and anti-phase last week, where an in-phased coordination pattern or intrapersonal coordination pattern, between two fingers. So this was an in-phase coordination pattern where, my index finger and my index finger is meeting my thumb at the same time as, and also achieving the apex at the same time. Whereas antiphase is where one hits the apex and the other hits the thumb, and vice versa, antiphase. And we see these same sorts of stable relationships emerge in one-on-one situations. So here we've got two people, right, measured over time on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have a measure of distance, position, of the radial distance from the player's center of mass to the center T point here. So the center T point in squash is interesting because it gives you an ability to get to any part of the court. And so if you're able to dominate the T, then you're more in control of the match, right? The other person is spending all of their energy running around chasing the ball. And so being close to the T is a good thing. So people will tend to return to it. And what we see here is, okay, so the players have started the match, and as one player chases a ball, their distance to the tee increases, right? So they're chasing down the ball and they hit it back, and then they return to the tee, and then the other player runs off, gets the ball, hits it, and then they return to the tee. So you get this anti-phase rally stability where both players are in a situation where we've got a cooperative coordination pattern going on. We see that at certain points in the rally towards the end here, we get these large fluctuations occurring, right? So maybe somebody made a particularly well-placed shot. They used some strategy such as shot placement. Maybe they deceived the opponent. They changed up the speed. Whatever it is, there's a large fluctuation. And we know that fluctuations are something that's associated with a phase transition. And we see here in particular a situation where suddenly both players are moving to the tee at the same time. So they move to a in-phase relationship, which is, in this case, in this sport, this is a unstable regime, and it's predictive that somebody is about to lose. Okay, so we've just used the same language that we use to describe the way in which people coordinate their body with respect to other parts of their body. We've used that same language and same approach to talk about how two people coordinate with one another. So hopefully that starts to, for those of you listening, pique your interest, because it shows that these concepts can be applied to different scales of analysis using the same basic principles, right? So the nice thing about this theory is it's highly generalizable. So I'm going to give another example of this and get into this concept of, how do we go about measuring coordination in team sports? And some of the work that's done this successfully. And I'm going to use rugby, a nice paper on rugby, one-on-one situations in rugby, where essentially what the researchers did is they set up a situation which was about 5 minutes wide, 15 meters long, and one player started on one end and the other player started on the other. One player's the defender and the other player's got the ball. And this player with the ball is trying to run past the defender and score a try. It's a try line at the other end of this channel here. And the researchers described, okay, there are three possible states, right, for this system. So, like we talk about states, you've got in-phase states, anti-phase states. So in this situation, we have three possible states, right? There's a state where the system is driven to this guy getting past without the other guy making any contact. That's one possible state, and that's a clean try. Another possible state is that he gets effectively tackled. So he just gets stopped in his tracks and perhaps even pushed backwards again and into the ground. That's an effective tackle. And then there's a third state that's possible, which is a tackle, but where the attacker gets past the defender and gets some sort of bit of territory and a little bit of an advantage, right? So these are three possible system out states that it's possible to drive toward. And the researchers wanted to know, okay, based on the way the system, why these two players are coordinating with one another, what's going to predict which state is going to emerge? And what they showed is that, look, if you wanted to make a effective try or a clean try, there were certain rules that if you were able to follow those rules, you'd have a much higher chance of scoring a try. And so the key for them was that, or what they found after running this repeatedly, this situation repeatedly, is that it turned out that once you had a 4-meter distance with your opponent, once you entered this high proximity distance to your opponent of less than roughly 4 meters, A clean trigger is predicted as long as the ball carrier can maintain a relative velocity of greater than 1 meter per second. Relative velocity. So a positive relative velocity relative to your opponent shows that you're moving faster than they are by 1 meters per second, irrespective of what direction. Okay. And this, if we can follow this simple rule, if we can achieve this, right, then as the ball carrier, then we're much more likely to try. And this shows that one of the key constraints in this particular task is interpersonal distance, but it's only an important constraint at particular distances, right? If they're really far apart, then their movements aren't really that important. It's only once they're within 4 meters of one another that it becomes important that you're able to achieve a particular relative velocity to your opponent. And so this is one of the ways in which research looking at coordination in team sports helps to give us, ground rules and a basis for, analyzing and assessing players, how well they're doing, and give them strategies and ways of potentially improving their performance in various what we can call sub-phases of the game. Okay, so this figure here presents this as in terms of data. So if we were to try to measure the players and have a measurement that indicates what their state is, the measure that these researchers used was something they call a collective variable or order parameter. And it was the angle between an attacker and a defender relative to the try line, right? So you'd have a positive 90-degree angle here between the attacker and defender if the attacker was immediately in front of the defender and the defender was between the attacker and the try line. If the attacker was next to the defender over here, you'd have a value of 0, right? If they get into here, you're getting into negative. They then would flip the values so that if the attacker's on the other side of the defender, closer to the try line, then we'd have a negative 90 degrees. So these angle values indicate the state of the system. Okay. And if we observe this angle over the time course of a trial, what we see is, okay, we have an initial state that's stable where the attacker is on the other side. The defender is between the attacker and the try line, and then the attacker's moving, they're starting to get closer and closer, and we start to see these fluctuations, right? Critical fluctuations, and then suddenly there's a phase transition to a new stable state where the attacker is on to the other side. Is now, he's caused a phase transition, and the attacker is now closer to the try line. Okay. And again, these critical fluctuations, this is basically any sort of strategy or behavior that's going to help destabilize this relationship so that we can facilitate a transition, so that we can get an advantage and win. And the point here is that, okay, if we think about this in terms of our constraints-based model and what's going on, okay, so we have the individuals, we have the environment, we have the task, and they're impacting on what they perceive and how they act. And as the players come into a distance where it becomes relevant, where their relative movements are irrelevant, they start to co-adapt to one another. And they create information which is beneficial for them to be able to achieve their task. So obviously the attacker, if we follow the findings of this experiment, the attacker is going to be acting, at least when they're within a 4-meter proximity of their defender, they're going to be acting in such a way as to maintain a relative velocity greater than 1 meter per second. As long as they can maintain that relationship, they're going to be afforded a try, a clean try. Okay, so that's the link to the constraints-based model that we've learned previously. And again, as a coach or a therapist, your goal, if you want to help people to pick up on these and pick up on these opportunities for action, and you can manipulate constraints to help them do that. Maybe if the task is super easy for an attacker, and so there's no real co-adaptive information there, just because perhaps the defender is not so good or something like that, you might create a smaller, narrower channel so that the defender has a bit more of a even playing ground, and it forces the attacker to pick up on this, managing that relationship more carefully. So facilitating co-adaptation, ways in which we can manipulate constraints in order to help this process along, so that essentially so that we can facilitate learning. So there are lots of factors that require people to co-adapt. One example, one that's often overlooked, is the diversity across different people. So, if we look at this lineup here, we have a bunch of judo athletes going from right to left here. We have white belts, yellow belts, green belts, blue belts, maybe some brown belts, and some black belts at the end here, right? And we can suppose that the black belts, they have a greater diversity of ways in which they can throw somebody compared to the beginners. And so particularly for the beginners, they benefit from that diversity because the experts can help draw the attention of the beginners, help them to learn those various strategies so that these beginners can start to increase the ways in which they can throw. So the greater the diversity of the group, the more the overall group can learn, essentially. To give an example of facilitating co-adaptation in soccer, okay, so what I've presented here is, somebody's done some research where they've looked at the interpersonal distance between an attacker between players when they do various tasks that are important in futsal. So one task being, for instance, to kick a goal, and another one to pass to a teammate. And what the researchers did is that they looked at these interpersonal distances under different game formats, where they have small-sided games and they have different numbers of players. So they have a 5 versus 3 situation, 5 versus 4 situation, 5 versus 5, so an equal situation. So a typical futsal situation, I believe there's 5 players per futsal team, right? I'm no expert. So what they show is that for successful shots, so in order to be able to successfully score a goal in futsal, successful goals in futsal in 5 versus 3 formats, right, require that you have a distance, or that the successful goals on average had a interpersonal distance between the shooter and the closest player of the overall team. Of the closest player. Of 3.2 meters. Right, so a pretty relatively big distance. And this was the same for 5 versus 5, but then it drastically reduces for 5 versus 4, then it drastically reduces for 5 versus 5, almost halves. Okay, and what this shows is, as we add more players, it makes the requirements to, the requirement to manage that interpersonal distance more and more extreme. Okay, so it, on the one hand, it should draw the player's attention to the importance of regulating that, right? And by perhaps relaxing the constraints by making it 5 versus 3 instead of 5 versus 5, that may also help them learn to, or give them a chance to learn how to take advantage of that distance. Okay. We can also see that, all right, so if we go from 5 versus 3 to 5 versus 5 formats, the required distance for a successful pass also reduces. So successful passes would tended to be very short, right? And again, this is useful as a coach because you can facilitate people learning and practicing long passing, medium passing, and very short passing by just manipulating the number of players on the field. And this is going to help them to, learn different skills, and it's also going to help them to become aware of, the importance of managing particular relationships. I'll give another example here in this case called using this concept called metastability. How do we optimize this process of co-adaptation to facilitate learning? There's another concept called metastability. The idea here is that if we can position or set up constraints that promote metastable situations, then we're going to increase co-adaptation and increase the likelihood that new skills and new ways of solving problems will emerge. Okay? And so this is one way in which we think that it's possible to help facilitate creative behavior. And an example of this can be shown in cricket. So if you were to launch a cricket ball, and there's, suppose you're a bowler, right? And you throw a ball. We can think about perhaps balls that are easy for a front foot shot. These tend to be bounce points over here, and balls that promote a back foot shot, which would be a short ball, right? These, if we throw into either one of these regions, the same, it's very predictable what the outcome is going to be, okay? Whereas there are certain distances at the intermediate range, some sort of intermediate distance between these 2 points, where both front foot shots and back foot shots are kind of equally probable, right? It's 50-50 which one's going to get used. And these regions of where you have equally probable actions, these are referred to as metastable regions. And if any small adjustment or little variation in this region, it forces the person to make adjustments, and you can have totally new actions that emerge from this critical region. So this is an example of a metastable region. When you're requiring people to perform in here, they have to be very careful, and partly a consequence of that is it can allow for and require them to develop novel strategies for solving that problem. So we get the possibility for new skills to emerge in these regions. Another thing, of course, if we think about it, is it can also give the bowler an advantage potentially, right? So bowling to these regions where the player is sort of caught between 2 ways of doing it, this is more likely to be a region that's unstable, right? It's sort of at a bit of a hill between 2 valleys. And if that's the case, then by bowling into this region, you might be able to increase the likelihood that you're going to get the player in 2 minds and get them out. I just want to give this another example just to reinforce this concept of metastability. I'm using the boxing example from last week. Again, if we have a look at a situation where we scale the distance of a boxing bag to a boxer based on their arm length, there are certain distances, roughly at about 0.6 of their arm length, where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different skills or ways of striking that are equally probable. So this is a really nice distance to try to develop, multiple skills, and potentially, the emergence of novel skills as well. And as an attacker, if you can get people into these distances, then you've got more options to hit them with. As a defender, you want to, ideally, you're hoping to avoid these sorts of regions because the attacker probably is going to have an advantage. Having said that, those regions, as a trainer, I'll just go back onto it. As a trainer, as a coach, it's interesting. So if you work with two people two beginners, one of the challenging things is like, how do you set up rules and constraints so that the players feel comfortable enough to enter these regions, right? Because perhaps judo is a good example, that two players hold each other. And one thing you can do to prevent yourself entering this distance is to just block your arms, right? And that means that, essentially you're trying to shut everything down, and not much happens when people do this, when they stiff arm. It's really hard to learn how to do different techniques when you've prevented essentially the system to enter these regions. So if you want to promote learning somehow, and the ability to explore these techniques, somehow you have to manipulate the constraints so that people can relax, perhaps, so that they can start to enter and explore those regions, right? And there are lots of different strategies for this. We can use instructions, we could use fatigue, right? Make them do lots of push-ups so that it's really tiring to hold like that. There's various strategies and approaches. It can also be a bit of a cultural thing in a sense, right? So if your gym is really competitive, then people might not feel like they want to take the risk, right? They don't want to look like an idiot, or they don't want to lose, so they sort of act really, really cautiously, and this might shut down their ability to learn. So I'm going to pick up on this final concept now called degeneracy. So one of the ideas in this theory is that, in dynamical systems theory, is when we practice in these regions where we have multiple solutions to a problem, we learn, or we explore these multiple solutions, and this builds up or increases the movement system degeneracy. And what this term means, it sounds a bit weird, of course. What it means is the system components can be brought into different ways. There are different ways in which we can the system components can be arranged in order to achieve the same outcome. So we can use different techniques to achieve exactly the same outcome. Different techniques to achieve the outcome of throwing someone on their back, for example. Different techniques to be able to hit the ball for a 4, for example. And we want to increase a person's degeneracy because it allows them to be more flexible in the face of changing situations. And the way in which we do that is we expose the system to metastable regions. Okay? And that's, again, up to the coach or therapist to manipulate constraints in order to support and facilitate this. Okay, so now that we've worked through this first part, the remaining parts are relatively quick. This is, I suppose, the biggest part of the lecture. I want you to look at this question here. What is the difference between interlimb and inter-individual coordination? How would you explain the difference between these two? All right. Take a 5-minute break, have a coffee if you will, and I will see you in a bit for the next section where we look at some evidence. Okay, so welcome back. We're now going to push into the research that supports this approach on interpersonal coordination. We're going to look at two different areas in particular. We're going to look at benefits in the health context, and we're going to look at it in terms of a sport context. We're going to link it back to concepts that we've touched on previously in week 9, the concept of representative design. So to start with, just a little bit of background here is that it's needed to understand this work is that this concept that complexity is a measure of how healthy a system is, okay, or potentially how healthy a human being is, right? So one way that we measure this idea of degeneracy or the ability to do lots of different things to achieve an outcome, a way in which we can measure this, quantify it with a value or a number, is that we analyze a behavior. We analyze these behaviors, that we observe, over time, and we get a measure of how complex that behavior over time is. And there are different ways that we can assess a set of values or observations to see, if we've got a low amount or a high amount of complexity. And I want you to think about these measures or techniques as, a toolbox of complexity measures, okay? And the example I want to give here is, imagine you've got a time series at the top here, okay? We have a series of steps. Someone's they're stepping along, and you measure the distance between each step, okay? Here we've got a measure of, in particular, something called the step width. So this is the width between two successive heels, right? So if this is really wide, right, if it's a large value, it means that they have a wide gait, right, in order to be stable. Or if it's relatively narrow, right, so it's a small value, it means that, they're kind of more walking with the with their feet 1 foot in front of another, okay? And with each value, okay, with peak and value up and down, this is a single step. So step, 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 step. This line here jumps around as the width of the step changes. Okay. Now, this is what we call, and you'll come across this term a lot as you start to analyze these sorts of signals. Next year, you're going to do biomechanics, and we call something like this a time series, right? Because we're plotting a value over time. It's a time series. So complexity measures, most complexity measures measure time series, and they try to assess, in that time series, they try to assess how predictable this time series is, or how complex it is. And if we look at these two values, we've got, on the top here, we've got a healthy individual, right, these two time series, and on the bottom we have somebody with something called chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. You're going to learn, of course, about that. You'll learn about that next year. And it's a disease associated with poor health and a lack of exercise. So it's a lifestyle-related disease. Now, if we look at the two signals, and I asked you, okay, which signal is healthy and which one isn't? It's actually, not easy to do just by eyeballing it. Just by looking at these two signals, I mean, who knows which is which, right? And so complexity measures allow us to, do this sort of complicated work. And the way it works is that they look at the, at each successive value, and they do it over increasing window sizes. And essentially what they're able to show is, okay, so there are repeating behaviors or ways in which this line move through the time series. And if there's a repeating behavior that's really, really consistent, so there's lots and lots of repetition, then that signal is you would describe it as a predictable signal. Okay, there's a structure to that signal that's very predictable or repetitive. Okay, if we've got a range of different behaviors, so we have a range of adaptive strategies as we walk. We've got multiple things going on that are influencing our walking pattern. Typically, this is a sign of good health, but what will be picked up in these complexity measures is these multiple strategies or behaviors as we're moving. Okay, and so we will end up with a value of that indicates that this signal is more complex. Okay. We can also, based on this sort of analysis, we can also get a measure of how random the signal is. So the signal could also be totally random, and we're able to assess that as well. Okay. And there's some great textbooks out there. It's more advanced level of knowledge, I suppose. So something that you can learn about in your second, third year, as well as stuff that you can learn about in your postgraduate studies if you're interested. There's a range of textbooks that are out there that provide ways of analyzing signals like these to obtain, measures of how random, how complex, or how predictable a certain behavior is. And there's a basic theory that that works that we talk about, or that's used in complex systems theory or in dynamic systems theory, where behaviors which are random, right? They're usually indicating that the system is, not working in a way that's related to the environment. So these systems that operate randomly are typically dysfunctional. So they're unable to work properly, essentially. So imagine if you were walking along and you just randomly stepped wherever you just randomly varied your step length. At some point, you're going to trip over, right? We also have, on the other end of the spectrum, we have really predictable behavior. So really rigid, always the same behavior. And again, if you're walking along and you precisely always use the exact same step length, the exact same step width, at some point you're going to trip over, right? Because again, you're working in a manner which is, in some sense, independent of the environment. Signals or ways of behaving which are adaptable or adaptive mean that we're modifying our gait and the way we're stepping and moving with respect to the environment, and the environment contains a degree of complexity that we sort of match or have to adapt to, and that behavior or that adaptation gets reflected in things that we can measure, such as step width. Okay, so one of the key take-home points of this slide, if you take home any, is that a person who is who's able to display complex behavior, typically this is associated with good health. Okay. And another variable or way of thinking about this, you might have heard about this, and you'll learn about it next year as well, is this concept of heart rate variability, right? So there's a bit of variation between the time between heartbeats. And that variation, if we were to measure it and assess it based on these techniques, would be complex, right, and a sign of good health. So if the heartbeat is suddenly the time interval between successive heartbeats is always the same, it's an indication that the person is sick. Okay, so complexity is a sign of health, and we see it in terms of different chronic diseases. We see it with aging. We see a loss of complexity with injury. We see a loss or a lack of complexity in people who aren't skilled. Okay, so as people become more skillful, turns out that they start to behave in more complex ways. So we start to work in this sort of region here. Okay. And I want to give an example of an experiment involving elderly individuals and get across this idea that we can help improve someone's complexity in order to benefit their health, using some of the principles from dynamical systems theory. And one interesting experiment, recent experiments, one of the few that have looked at this effect in human health, was where they looked at elderly people, and they looked at their walking gait, and they had individuals who were on average about 72 years old. Okay, and what they did was an intervention where one group, the group with these blue bars, the control group, what they would do is they would walk around an oval next to a healthy young adult, okay, without touching them, without holding their hands. Okay, so they did this 15 minutes per week for three walking sessions per week, and the complexity of their stride length, right, was measured, was assessed. Okay, and what we can see from week 1, 2, 3, 4, and into a post-test, right, assessment, and these assessment trials for both conditions are done just walking by themselves. Okay, now we can see that this measure of complexity has stayed pretty low. So this indicates that the behavior is fairly predictable. So their step length is really similar from one step to the next. They're keeping a fairly rigid step length. Okay. The experimental group, what they did was they had, again, 72-year-old participants walking around for 15 minutes, walking around an oval, and for 15 minutes per session, 3 times a week, right? And during their walk, they held hands with a young healthy adult. Okay, and what they showed is that, look, after week 1, 2, and 3, there was no real change in their behavioral complexity. Okay, so they remain relatively predictable, these red bars. But then after week 4 and into the post-test, you get this improvement or increase in complexity of the elderly participants' walking gait. Okay, indicating, and we take this to indicate that some of the behavioral complexity or adaptability of the younger adult has been learned, by the older adult by virtue of holding onto their hands while walking. Okay, and it indicates that this adaptive capacity is something that can be trained, and it can be helped to, it can be included potentially as a kind of therapy. And I think perhaps to make this, I like this figure here, or this image here, to help this concept stick, is that it's interesting with elderly individuals, just if they've got poor balance, poor postural stability, you can really improve their postural stability just by having them with finger touch. Just if they were to put their hand on your shoulder without putting their weight on it, their postural stability will improve dramatically. Okay, so it's interesting that that we can improve our postural stability or walking stability by walking with younger and healthy adaptive individuals. Okay. There's also an example of this in sport, and one of the ways that we can increase the complexity of an athlete's performance behavior is by manipulating conditions or constraints to create more complex conditions of practice, or practice which is potentially more representative of the competition situation. And I want to show how this, I'll walk you through an experiment to exemplify. So this study here, 2012, what they did is they took some experienced futsal players, and they in one condition, right, their first condition, they had players just passing a ball back and forward to the same player, right? So we have these 4 players and they just choose a partner and they just always passing back and forward, okay? They had a second condition where players, instead of passing to their adjacent teammate, they passed to their opposite teammate. So they had to pass the ball across this pitch. And what you can note, this situation is slightly more complex now because when you pass, you have to make sure that your ball doesn't bump into the pass of the other player. So you have to be a bit more aware and manage that and adapt to the other people who are passing. Okay, so it makes the situation more complex, right? And then condition 3, now it's a situation where you can pass to 2 people. Each person can potentially pass to 2 people. Again, they're going to have to be, before they make their pass, they're going to have to be more careful about where that ball is. And the final condition is a situation where they can pass to anybody they want. Okay. Again, more options, more possibilities to hit that ball or pass to somebody who already has the ball, right? And so you have to be a bit more careful and adaptive under these conditions. Okay. And what the study did, what the researchers did, is they measured the velocity of the ball. So as the ball moves, it changes in position over time, and you get this value of velocity of the ball, right? And that's what this figure here shows, okay? So as this value increases, the ball speed increases and then it slows down just before it gets received, right? So each of these hills is a pass, okay? Now what their findings were, and a final condition that they also measured ball velocities in were during matches. So during futsal matches, they also measured ball velocities, okay, of passes. And they used a measure of complexity. It's called approximate entropy. And they assessed, on this time series, they obtained the approximate entropy of that time series. Okay. In condition 1, we can see that the entropy is relatively low. And then as we increase the degree of complexity, the approximate entropy increases, okay, all the way up to condition 4, which shows the highest level of complexity. And then what we see here is there's no difference between the amount of complexity in these ball velocity time series data under the condition 4 compared to the match condition. So that shows that there's a matched level of complexity, or at least the variation in the way in which people have to pass is somewhat similar to matches. It won't be a perfect match, of course, but somewhat similar. And so we would expect that there would be greater transfer between condition 4 in helping people to prepare to learn how to pass to an open player and modulate their passing appropriately in matches. Okay. And just to highlight this, I've also given a figure of between figure B and figure C here. We have in figure B we have all of these passes over time. And one of the things you should notice is that, all of these profiles look really similar, right? So they have a really similar looking velocity profile. It increases, decreases, and it's always sort of roughly the same sort of velocity. And so each pass is very similar to the other pass, each other pass, right? So you have a high degree of similarity. And so a low amount of complexity. It's a very predictable kicking behavior, right? And then when we get to condition C, where you have to pass to an open man and you have to dodge the ball and all that sort of thing, we see this So there's, it might be there's a pass like in condition B, and then there's a pass that's more of a, I guess, a thudded pass. Maybe there's a slow pass. There's a really fast pass. There's a range of different passes, and this might be because they're varying the velocity. It might be that they're kicking off their outside of their foot, the inside of their foot, the toe of their foot. But each of these passes are a little bit different. There are some that are similar. This pattern here looks maybe this pattern here, looks a little bit similar to this one here. Actually, this one here is also quite similar. So we have multiple strategies or ways of kicking the ball that are occurring in C, and that's why the complexity increases. Okay, and that's what complexity measures in a nutshell. Try to assess. Okay, so again, this is an example of how when we set up situations that are representative, they don't necessarily need to exactly match the situation in competition, but if we are able to achieve similar levels of behavioral complexity from one context to another, we're more confident we're going to achieve a more transfer between the training context and the competition context. Okay. All right, so now that you know what you know, after working through this session, I just want you to look at this question of, okay, is it more or less useful to learn with someone better than us? What do you think about this question now? Do you think that this girl is benefiting by training with this person here? Is he benefiting? Is his skill going to increase by training with her? What do you think? Okay, so welcome to the final part for the lecture. We're going to look on this, on applying these ideas in order to facilitate motor creativity. We'll look at the role of interpersonal coordination in doing this. Okay, so motor creativity, it refers to actions that are both original, okay, they're novel in some way, and they're also functional. So they help a person achieve their objectives. Okay, a lot of the early research in this area in creativity is looked primarily at ideational creativity. So looking at studying, trying to understand how it is that people come up with new ideas that other people haven't come up with before, but ideas that are also, on the one hand, new, but also effective, appropriate at solving problems. And the ways in which creativity has been studied, there's a broad range of techniques, or variables that also get measured when they do these sorts of research. And one is a measure of originality. So this is the number of relatively uncommon solutions. Feasibility, to what extent the solution is supporting outcomes. A measure called fluency, which is the number of times they do something that doesn't repeat, so the number of unique actions or ideas that they come up with. And they do this, or they obtain these measures under two sort of different task conditions. They do it in this ideational research, they do it under divergent tasks or something called insight tasks. So divergent tasks, these are tasks where the person is asked to come up with as many different solutions as they can. And things like broad attention is important, so the ability to make associations across different categories, or different disciplines. Working memory is not so important in these sorts of tasks, so you don't really necessarily need to remember what you've done before. This concept that the ability to think divergently, so to think quite differently, or to come up with lots and lots of different ideas, irrespective of how feasible they are, is considered to be useful in these sorts of tasks. Okay. Another way ideational researchers studied creativity has been using insight tasks. So this is tasks where there's really only one solution, and so there's something that the participant going in doesn't know what the solution is, and they're presented with a problem, and kind of requires one of these aha moments in order to find a solution. And so it's a way of, again, seeing the ways in which people try to solve this problem, and the ability to solve these sorts of problems also in some way being associated or indicating how creative the person is. And what I've got on the figure here, right, is an example of a particularly creative motor behavior. So, and the point here is that in order to study creativity that's ideationally based, these ideas have been imported into sports science, okay? And they've started to be used to understand or study how it is that people come up with new ways of doing things, moving, that help them improve their performance or get some sort of performance advantage. And one sort of broad way we could capture all these ideas is, so when we observe a behavior, we can look at it on an axis of originality and feasibility. And if it's somewhere in between or somewhere up in this sort of area of the quadrant, we've got a creative behavior. And I've put a little dot here saying there's a kind of a knowledge and skill threshold. So people have to achieve a certain degree of capability within a particular discipline before they can start to enter these regions. Okay, and another point that needs to be made is that when we talk about original behavior, it's important that we think about the frame of reference. So people can make a behavior that's original within a group of participants, right? Or they can make a behavior that's original relative to themselves. They can do something they've never done before. We can also think about people doing something different that's different at its social scale. So nobody in society or on the planet, if we actually know what everyone's done, right, has done that before. And so this kind of distinguishes between different levels of originality. And in research tasks, we don't have access to the whole population. So what we're dealing with is people's level of originality or creativity with respect to a sample of participants. Okay? And we generalize their behavior under those conditions to the population and think that might be an interesting way to see if we can understand creativity and then extend those findings to see if we can support creativity at a social level. And yes, the example I like to use when talking about creativity, just to reinforce what it is I'm talking about, is the Fosbury flop. Okay, so we've got the Fosbury flop here. This is a situation where Dick Fosbury jumped over the high jump bar, 1968 Mexico Olympics, won gold. He was the only athlete to do it, and he was the first to use it in competition, particularly at this level. And the rest is kind of history in a sense, in that look, that's a technique everyone uses now, right? Because it's really the most effective that we know of. So I'm going to move forward now and just talk about how could we imagine divergent and insight tasks that are similar, that instead of thinking about ideational tasks, let's talk about and think about movement tasks, which might fit that description. So the example I like to give is, suppose you've got a basketball player, right? And you scale the distance to the hoop. Now, as we change, if we're really close to the basket, we can just do like a layup, right? As we go further back, we might use a more sort of considered movement like this, like you see in the free throw. And as we go further back still, we might need to put more energy into the throw, so we might use like a double-handed throw. So in a divergent doing task, it's the kind of situation where, you might propose to a participant that they try to put the ball into the hoop in as many different ways as possible. And this, of course, is facilitated, right, the ability to discover these greater, broader range of techniques if we scale certain constraints, so such as the distance to this basket. And hopefully you can see the relationship between the first half of the lecture and to the content and the material that we covered last week. So there are these by modifying these constraints, we help people to explore different ways of solving problems. And this, in a sense, can give rise to creative behavior. Again, creative behavior being something that can be useful for performance. And I've given an example here down the bottom where, like, imagine you've just got the person on the same position, right? You don't scale forwards and backwards from the basket, but instead you change the height of the ceiling, okay? Well, in order to solve this problem, there's a range of different ways you could try to do it. I don't know which one would be the easiest. All of these could probably solve the problem. This one here, where you bounce it off the roof, I think might be a good candidate. Again, someone who is more creative and willing to explore all of these different options is potentially more likely to be successful in solving this task. So, and we might consider that person more creative by virtue of all of these original actions, many of which are also functional. We can also think, and now I've talked about, okay, we can be creative in terms of using different techniques, right? And that gives us a kind of advantage. And, it also gives an indication of how creative someone is. And look, if we give somebody a divergent doing task, then yeah, it is functional to change our behavior, right? Because the constraints changing, so in order to solve that problem, we have to modify what we do. Okay, so that makes perfect sense, hopefully. Flexibility is functional under these sorts of divergent doing conditions. We can also think about movement variability as being something that's helpful to us when we do the same action. Okay, so suppose we have a basketball hoop, right? There's no backboard, just a basketball hoop, and instead of scaling the radial distance to the basket, we just change the position on a imaginary circle, on the circumference of an imaginary circle from that basket, keeping the radius the same. Okay, so they're always shooting from the same distance. Okay, and we might expect that, well, the person is going to settle with the technique which is most suitable for that distance. But for each change in position, or each repetition, right? Each repetition, the person is going to vary a little bit the throw, okay? And by exploring the different control solutions, or within technique variability, this allows them to know, what are the limits of this technique? In what ways can it work? Under what sort of speeds or heights or whatever, and what don't. So we can also, if we think about it, be creative in terms of the way in which we control a particular technique. Okay. You could also imagine achieving this sort of ability to explore the same technique by, instead of changing the position on a circle, I've also given an example of changing perhaps the width of the basket as well. Okay. So again, the point here is to say that, look, when we have divergent tasks, flexibility is a kind of solution. With insight tasks, we might think of optimization as a way of solving the problem. Now, I want to get into talking about functional movement variability now, and talk about and relate those previous concepts to talking about movement and performance in sport. So if we think about the Fosbury flop, right? So I want to give an example of, bring up another old presentation I've done from, not this one. If we look at this Fosbury flop, I want you to observe this film and just pay particular attention to both of these concepts, the idea of a totally different technique and the idea that, sorry, in order to be successful, we can also vary the technique itself. So we can explore the coordination, or we can explore the control of the action. Okay, so where is it? I think it's this one here. Okay. Okay, so let's stop it there. Sorry, get out of here. All right, so hopefully, at the beginning of the video, what you noticed is, we had the Fosbury flop, and then, it's been sort of evolved up to present day. And hopefully, if you're paying attention, you're noticing that, sometimes people would, if we look at Fosbury here, he's jumping over and his hands are by his side, and we notice that, as the performance keeps improving over the years, we've got people who are using their arms, both arms, one arm, they're using different types of angles for the run up. They have people who are now very flexible in the spine. You can look at the flexibility of Dick Fosby. Looks like he's on a lazy chair compared to the flexibility in the spine of athletes today. And so what we see is a optimization that's occurring in this technique, and this comes from creative movement variability at the level of how they're controlling their degrees of freedom. And I think this is a perfect example of a exploration and releasing of the degrees of freedom over time in the long jump. So Dick Fosby, I'd say he's pretty he's frozen a lot of the degrees of freedom here, not using his arms, for instance. Okay, and that worked for him. He was still able to win the gold medal with this action, but he was the only one he was using. He had such a performance advantage using this coordination solution. But over time, people have released and started to exploit the degrees of freedom to such an extent that we continue to improve performance. On the other hand, we have creative motor behavior at the level of coordination, right? At the level of the technique, where over the years, people have been they start jumping face to face, facing the bar, just running directly at it, versus going over it with the scissors or rolling over the bar, etc. Okay, and those changes in the technique led to little jumps in performance, sort of breakthroughs in performance, right? And then followed by that, a sort of an incremental increase in performance as other athletes started to adopt that novel technique. So two ways or two levels at which people can be creative. And the question I want to pose to you and I want you to think about is, why did Dick Fosby flop? What caused him to do this? Is it because he's a creative genius, right? Is it because he's just thought long and hard about how to do this, and he's done the math, and then he's like, bang, I know how to solve this problem better than anyone else. Here it is. Or is it something else? And look, one of the interesting sort of stories about the Fosby flop is we can identify multiple kind of constraints that might have supported this or facilitated this. And probably the most important one, if we think about it, is, or at least one of the important ones, is that they introduced these high-density foam safety mats. So early on, people would run up and jump onto sand, and then perhaps they'd pile up some leaves, right? But then technology evolved, and they started using these safety mats, and then it became actually feasible, right, or functional to land on your back. So early on, if you landed on your back, it's not a functional technique because you can't train landing on your back because you could kill yourself, right? You could really hurt yourself. So it would have been an original behavior, but not functional. Once they introduced these foam safety mats, it's now a functional behavior and something that people can explore and practice and improve on, and use to a point that they can use in a competition setting. And you can actually look up Dick Fosby and hear his story about how he developed it. And he often describes discovering it while he's practicing. And the reason why he discovered it, one of the big reasons, was he wasn't very successful with the dominant technique of the day. So I believe it was the Western roll, one of these types of rolls, right? Or the straddle, sorry. And he just wasn't very powerful in the legs. He was very lanky compared to the other athletes, and he really struggled to perform well. And so for him, in order to be able to be a good high jumper, he had to find a different way of doing it. And so his individual constraints, right, caused him to, or prompted him or facilitated him to explore a bit. He also had this added benefit of the safety mat, so he could explore different ways of jumping. And this, in some respects, facilitated the discovery of jumping over backwards. And he says that he sort of accidentally found it one day, like he just went over a different way, and all of a sudden he was like, he invested in exploring that that solution and ultimately, took it to the Olympic Games and won the gold medal with it. So well done. A very final thing that I'll note is it turns out that there's also a lady from Canada. Her name's Brenda Brill, right? She apparently also developed this same technique independently of Dick Fosbury at about the same time. And what this sort of shows is that it's not really necessarily that, again, the individual being responsible for this new technique. It's that the conditions, the environmental conditions, this technology has actually made it possible for other people to find it. So, and of course, across all of that, the reason people devote time to exploring and trying to find some sort of an edge, or even bother exploring and practicing this stuff, right, is there's a competition. There's this social level sort of interest in this sport, and this competition also is facilitating this creative behavior, because it's facilitating this desire to explore and find ways of winning, essentially. So, individuals differ in the way in which, or their tendency to explore. And this reflects a kind of individual constraint. And I want to give an example of what this kind of looks like in an experiment I did a few years back, looking at creativity in boxing. And one of the things that I did is I looked at, okay, we've got the possibility to vary the way in which we hit a bag with the same hand, but we can also vary in terms of what part of the body we use. And last week I showed you a guy who explored hitting this bag and needing to hit a target force, and he found the solution that worked, and it was with his back fist with the right arm. And it's interesting, you've got some people who, for whatever reason, they explore a task and they don't change. They just always do the same thing. So I want to show you what this looks like. So this is the experiment here. Let me bring it up. So this individual. He hit the bag. So he's got a foam glove on his left hand that makes it really ineffective to use that hand. He's been told he can use any part of his body, and he's trying to hit the bag at a certain force. He's not having much success. He hit the bag something like 250, 300 times in this experiment before giving up. And he just kept using that hand. No success. You can see he's trying to bring a bit more energy into it by rotating a bit more. So he's exploring a bit. So he is varying at the level of control. Not so at the level of coordination. And you might describe this as persistent search. We can call this or characterize this exploratory behavior as persistent. And if you want someone to change, right, explore differently, and learn how to explore, right, off their own bat, then, as a coach, you can use different strategies. One thing you can do is just tell the person what to do, right? But you're not always going to be there to solve the problem for the athlete. And, one of the key skills of being an athlete, or somebody, navigating in environments which vary or require some adaptability, is that people learn how to, they need to learn how to do this themselves. So what you can do is, of course, modify the constraints, and perhaps that will help facilitate the exploration of different ways of solving this problem. Might also be, look, he might need to sleep on it, right? He might need a few more sessions before he goes, oh, you know what? Actually, maybe if I try something else, or what have you. But obviously, if we do want to change this behavior, we're going to have to intervene as a coach, and ideally we do it without telling them what to do, right? We allow them to learn to explore, and we can do that by perturbing the system a little bit, maybe changing the orientation of the target on the bag so that it's closer to his other hand, or something like that. Okay. Another option, and look, if we compare this to what I showed you last week, you have an individual who just immediately is just trying everything, right? And how do we explain the difference between the two? We explain it on the basis of their intrinsic dynamics. Okay. Okay. So get out of this one, and I can bring back my. All right. Now I'm gonna progress. Now I've been talking about individual sports here. I'm gonna end this lecture on a situation in team sport and ways in which we've looked at this question in team sports in soccer using small-sided games. Okay, so we can facilitate creative behavior in soccer during training also by manipulating constraints. And small-sided games is one way in particular that's interesting to do so. And some of this data here that I'll talk through it was designed to see whether or not small-sided games facilitated more creative behavior compared to full-sized formats. And small-sided games essentially is you keep the number of players the same, but you reduce the area in which they're playing. So there's a greater player density for a given area. And if you think about what that does, it means that they're just the ball's going to have to be kicked around a lot more frequently because people are going to be near to each other, so you can't really hold on to the ball. Big kicks aren't really that possible. So if you see this sort of situation with kids or what have you, there's a lot more contact on the ball and touches on the ball, right? And this is something that the researchers were interested in. They were interested to see if, simply by increasing the number of actions that occur, does this relate to or correlate with the number of creative behaviors that occur? And what they show is, in 5 versus 5, these small-sided game formats versus 11 versus 11 full-sided game formats, okay, they show that we have larger number of touches on the ball. Okay, 5 versus 5, we have the most, and then steadily as we increase the number of players and reduce the playing density, right, we get a fewer number of touches, okay, on the ball. And they also showed that, the number of original and creative actions also higher in the 5 versus 5 format and practically non-existent in the 11 versus 11 format. And one of the implications of this study that I want you to think about is, so simply by virtue of repetition and practice, under these conditions which are representative and of the sport, this more repetition gives rise to more possibility, just through sheer chance, that we can discover new ways of doing things. So it's creativity in this sense is something that falls out of or comes from sheer by essentially movement, repetition without repetition. Okay. All right. So knowing what you know now, that's the end of the lecture. I'd like you to think on this question of, why did Fosbury flop? How do you explain that phenomenon? And I'd invite you to also think about, with your own sports and activities and that you're aware of, can you think of another creative behavior that's really revolutionized the sport? And think about it from different angles. Why did that happen? What's the explanation? And consider whether or not you can explain it across a range of constraints. Right, so these are the different questions for this lecture that I wanted you to be thinking about. Have a look at these again now, if you like, to consolidate your understanding. These are the tasks that I want you to go ahead and do for this week. And these are the learning objectives revised as revisions questions to help you prepare for the exam. Okay, thanks for listening. I will see you in the laboratory.